This episode contains discussions of violence, trauma, grief, and vigilantism. It explores themes of loss, revenge, and moral extremism. Listener discretion is advised. They say the system is supposed to protect you. That if something goes wrong, if the worst happens, someone will step in and make it right. That there are structures in place, people in place, designed to ensure that justice is not something you have to fight for on your own. But that belief only holds as long as the system works. Because when it doesn't, when the people meant to uphold justice hesitate, when the law bends under pressure, when the guilty walk away free while the innocent are left behind, something begins to shift. Not all at once, and not always in ways that are immediately visible, but slowly, quietly, permanently. Some people grieve in that space. Some people try to rebuild what they can and move forward, even when forward doesn't look like the way it used to. They hold on to the idea that things will balance out, that time or process or something larger than themselves will eventually correct what went wrong. And some people decide that waiting is no longer an option. They stop looking outward for justice and start looking inward. They convince themselves that what needs to be done is obvious, and that hesitation is weakness, that action is the only thing left that makes sense. And once that belief takes hold, it doesn't loosen its grip easily. Because to someone like that, this is not revenge. This is balance. This is correction. This is punishment. And once you step into that mindset, once you decide that you are the only one who gets to draw the line and enforce it, there is no returning to who you were before that decision was made. This is not the story of a hero. This is the story of a man who made a choice and never looked back. This is Frank Castle. This is Revenge in Madness, where we unravel the thin line between justice and insanity. Every story begins with a moment, not a loud one, not always something the world notices, but something that fractures the path a person was put on and replaces it with something else. A loss, a decision, a shift that changes everything that comes after it, whether they realize it in that moment or not. Some people experience that moment and walk away from it. They rebuild. They adapt. They find a way to keep going without letting it define who they are. Others try to carry it with them, to live alongside it, even when it reshapes how they see the world. And some people allow that moment to become everything. They begin to justify the choices that follow. They tell themselves it is necessary, that what they are doing is right. That line they crossed was never as real as the people that pretend it is. They reshape the narrative in a way that allows them to keep moving forward without looking back. But the truth is, that line always exists. The question is whether or not it is there. The question is not how far someone is willing to go before they can no longer return to it. Today, we are stepping into the mind of a man who did not hesitate, who did not question the path in front of him once it was set. A man who stopped believing that justice was something to be upheld and started believing that it was something to be enforced. This is the story of Frank Castle. But no one begins as the version of themselves that the world eventually sees. No one is born into the decisions that define them in the end. Because before punishment, before the violence, before any line is crossed, there is always something that comes first, something that breaks, something that changes the way a person understands the world around them and their place within it. And if you want to understand what someone becomes, you have to start with what they lost. Before he was the Punisher, Frank Castle was something much more simpler, something much easier to understand. He was a husband, a father, a man who had already lived through violence, but in a context that gave it structure and meaning. As a Marine, he existed in a world where conflict was expected, where the lines between right and wrong were defined by orders, by objectives, by a system that justified action even when the consequences were severe. He understood what it meant to take a life, more importantly, what it meant to carry that weight afterward. But there was a separation between that world and the one he returned to. At home, there was something steadier, something human, a life that existed outside of war, built on connection rather than conflict, a family that grounded him, that gave him something to return to that was not defined by survival or violence. And for that time, that life held. Until it didn't. What happened was not part of a battlefield. It was not tied to something larger than a war or a mission that with clear stakes or defined sides. It was something far more random, far more uncontrolled. A moment of violence that did not belong where it occurred, but it happened anyway. A park, an ordinary day, a space that should have been safe, and then it wasn't. His family was caught in the middle of something they were never meant to be a part of. No warning, no preparation, no control over what was happening or how it would end. And just like that, everything that defined his sense of stability was gone. This is the moment people point to, the moment they say they created the Punisher. But that idea oversimplifies something much more complicated, because loss does not decide what someone becomes. It's what they do next. Loss creates a fracture, but it does not fill the space it leaves behind. It opens something, leaves it exposed, unstable, waiting for something to take shape in its place. Grief does not remain in its original form forever. It shifts, it hardens, it searches for direction, for something to attach itself to make sense of what happened. Some people try to heal within that space. Others try to move past it entirely. And some begin to ask different kind of question. One that does not focus on why something happened, but who is responsible for it. And once that question takes hold, it does not stay contained. It grows. And eventually, it demands action. Frank Castle did not abandon his understanding of right or wrong. He rewrote it. From his perspective, the failure was not the act of violence itself, but everything that followed it. The system that was meant to respond did not act in the way he believed it should. Investigations slowed. Accountability weakened. The people responsible did not face consequences in the way he expected. And to someone like Frank, that was not just a failure of process. It was a failure of purpose. Because if the system exists to deliver justice, and it does not, then what is it there for? The question leads to a conclusion that feels simple, even if it is anything but. If the system cannot enforce justice, then justice must be removed from its control, not debated, not delayed, not filtered through procedure, enforced. That belief changes everything. Because once someone convinces themselves that they are the only one willing to do what is necessary, the rules that they once followed stop applying in the same way. The line between justice and punishment begins to blur, not suddenly, but gradually, until the distraction no longer matters. And with that mindset, every action can be justified, not because it is objectively right, but because it feels inevitable. Thanos. Belief does not remain internal. It does not sit quietly inside someone until it has taken hold. It moves outwards. It shapes behavior. It dictates decisions. And eventually, it demands to be proven. Because a belief like this cannot exist without action. And once action begins, it does not stop easily. Frank Castle does not declare war. He conducts it. There is no moment where he announces himself or asks to be understood. What follows is a quieter, more deliberate, and far more controlled than that. Every action is planned. Every target is selected with intention. Every outcome is considered before it unfolds. This is not chaos. It is structure. He does not see himself as someone who has lost control. He sees himself as someone who has taken it back. That distinction defines everything that follows. His methods reflect discipline, not impulse. Surveillance becomes routine. Interrogation becomes a tool. Elimination becomes a solution. There are no rules of engagement anymore. No authority to answer to. No system to question its decisions. Only his judgment. And his judgment is final. What makes this descent so complete is not just the violence itself, but the absence of resistance within him. There is no hesitation, no visible conflict, no moment where he considers stopping, because in his mind, stopping would allow the same cycle to continue, and that is not something he is willing to accept. So he continues, and over time, the distinction between who he is and what he does begins to disappear. The mission is no longer something he follows. It is something he becomes. But no one operates in isolation. Every action leaves something behind. A consequence, a reaction, a ripple that moves beyond the original intent. Violence does not end with a person who commits it. It spreads. Through the people it touches, through the system it disputes, through the fear it creates, and eventually the world responds. Frank believes he is creating order, that each action serves a purpose, that each outcome brings the world closer to something balanced. But the world does not organize itself around its intentions. It reacts. To the law enforcement, he represents a breakdown of authority, a challenge to the idea that justice belongs to a system rather than an individual. To people, he becomes a symbol of necessary action. To others, he is simply a form of violence, and that division matters. Because once someone has become a symbol, they stop being understood. They become something people interpret, something they project onto, something they use to justify their own beliefs. And when violence begins to feel justified, it stops being contained. Before we wrap this week, I wanted to share something a little bit more personal. This episode brought back a few connected memories that felt worth revisiting. And because this story involves someone who has passed on, it kind of feels more right to say it out loud than keep it in my head. What not many people remember is that in 2004, after Dolph Lundgren had portrayed Frank Castle in the 80s, it was now Thomas Jane's turn to take on the iconic skull vest and black trench coat in a way that felt new to us at that time. Yes, Blade had been out since 1999 and 2000 and 2003. We're really not going to talk about Blade Trinity. But back then, my brother and I, we were helping my cousin move from Regina. And we just moved her from this small town. It was about an hour and a half southeast of the city. And as a thank you, she took us to this wrestling show. But before that, we were going to go catch a movie. And you got to remember, this is about the time when Spider-Man 2 had just come out. And my brother and my cousin and I, we were all excited for it. But, I'd been trying to sneak into The Punisher since about Man on Fire, which was about May at that point. But I remember agreeing to this movie at first. But just something had gotten to me that day. I had been trying to see The Punisher for a while before that period. I even tried sneaking into a theater a few times, and I'm a giant, so I got caught most of that time. But I didn't exactly have a great plan. So instead, my cousin, she took us to a cheaper theater in Regina, and she bought us 3 tickets. 2 for $13 going on $30, and 1 for The Punisher. So we go grab our snacks, and we made our way to the guy checking the tickets, and then right as we passed him, we switched. That was my first true experience with Frank Castle. And yeah, I was grateful. I loved what I was watching. The version of the character that was on the screen and the Thomas Jane that brought it felt more intense, felt grounded, and real in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I remember walking out of that theater overjoyed. We went home after that, and life moved on. But it's one of those memories that stuck. One of those moments I still come back to when I think about the good times I had with my cousin. And may she rest in peace. So for me, after that, the next real time I encountered Frank in a meaningful way was through Daredevil. When I first heard that Jon Bernthal had been cast, I really didn't think much of it at that time. I had seen him in a few things, mostly Shane as The Walking Dead, and I really wasn't convinced. But when that second season dropped, it started to make more sense. There was a level of intensity that felt different than I had seen before, like with Ray Stevenson, with Thomas Jane, and you can feel the people were ready for this new version. It took a bit to fully click with me, and it really did. But for once, the Punisher got his own series, I was still in. Jon Bernthal is amazing at what he does with that character. Thomas Jane still has his place for me, and that version of his character will always be tied to that particular memory. But Jon Bernthal really brought something else to it. Something sharper, something more aggressive, something more grounded in a way that really only worked only because of the platform it was working on at that time. There was a big rawness to this that stood out. And while the studios have tried to recreate that kind of success since, bringing characters back and trying to rebuild that same energy, I don't think it's something that Disney or even people that are running Marvel can recreate it. Because really, that line of shows, except for Iron Fist, and we will talk about Iron Fist later on, is something that was lightning in a bottle. So before we move into our final verdict question, whatever you want to call it, I want to turn this over to you. Who was your first hero? The first character you saw and thought, I like this guy. And then later on, maybe you saw someone else step into that role and thought, I wonder what this could have been with something different. And if you want to revisit some of the versions for yourself, consider this your subtle reminder that the Punisher Warzone, and even the Punisher Dirty Laundry are still out there. And if this is the kind of story that sticks with you, then I recommend checking out the next take on Frank Castle when it arrives in Disney Plus this May. Because sometimes the versions people don't talk about much are the ones that stay with you the longest. So where does that leave us? We have seen what he lost, what he became, and the choices that carried him from one to the other. And none of it exists in isolation. Because the question he answers is not unique to him. What do you do when the system fails? For some, the answer is patience. For others, acceptance. For Frank, it is action. But once someone does something to enforce justice rather than exist within it, they are no longer upholding it. They are replacing it. And that is where the line disappears. Not because it was never there, but because it was crossed. So the question is not whether Frank Castle believes he is justified. He does. The question is whether that belief makes him right, or whether it simply makes him something else entirely. Because if justice becomes whatever one person decides it is, then it stops being justice at all. And once you accept that, you are left with something far more difficult to answer. If you had the same loss, the same pain, the same opportunity, would you make a different choice? Or would you do the same thing and just call it something else? And that's where we'll leave it. Not with an answer, but with a line that's harder to see than we'd like to admit. Because what we explored today was never just about one person. It was about the moment someone decides that what they are doing is justified, and everything that comes after that decision. The system has its own version of justice. People have theirs. And sometimes those two things do not line up. So the question isn't whether that line exists. It's what happens when someone decides it isn't. This is Revenge and Madness. And next time, we explore another story that sits somewhere between vengeance and justice. Until then, where do you draw the line?